Some of the things that I'm going to talk about today cross over a little bit with Robin and with Gregory, but I really want to kind of look at exploring some of the things that I think is really important, that are really important in terms of the way that we work and the way that we think around children who've experienced maltreatment. I tend to use that word a little bit more than child abuse and neglect. It's not to say that those terms aren't kind of relevant, but the research and the practice around maltreatment, I feel, really helps me kind of understand some of my work. I'm a clinician predominantly, and have kind of gone back into the heartland of clinical work. And the one thing I don't want to kind of overstate is how hard, I don't want to give an idealised image around the way that this work kind of goes. All of us have our constraints and all of us have our difficulties in this work. Some people often come to see me and I talk to them and they say, but I've only got 10 sessions to work with this child, yeah? And all I can say to that is, I can only tell you what I think is going to work, yeah? And when we're working with children and their families and the broader system, the thing that I don't think we can do is actually work in isolation. And that goes for people like me. Yes, I've done lots and lots of training around this area, but really the work and the success of any work that I've done has really been because there's been multiple others who've actually helped me, from OTs, speech pathologists, kindergarten teachers, childcare workers, parents, foster carers, schools, all those kind of contribute. And I guess, if I think about my own trajectory in terms of my learning, I've learnt a lot more through my treatment failures than my treatment successes. And that's made me continue to kind of engage in kind of a lifelong process of trying to think about what works and what works for whom, and how do we actually think about that when we're working. We talk about collaboration every single day, don't we? Like, all of us kind of speak about how important it is, but I know, because I still do the work, day in, day out, how hard is it when you make a phone call and you don't hear from someone for 3 days? Yeah, how hard is it when we have part-time staff who you need to connect up with? How hard is it to actually have a case conference? Yeah, how hard is it to meet together to collaborate? And yet we know that actually that's the work that's going to make a dramatic difference in actually what we do. That is, people coming together and thinking about what's happened to a child or children, and thinking a lot more about, okay, so what do we actually do with what happens? So often people come to see me with the question of, what's wrong with this child? Yeah, this is the question, yeah? And I guess as I've gone on, I'm much interested in the question, what's happened to this child? Yeah, and I think it kind of orientates us in a much different way. So let me begin. Now, this is really kind of emphasising kind of some of the points that I'm hoping to make today, and that is, that is that there is such an idea, and I think it exists across the field, where predominantly people are working with children who've experienced maltreatment, and the first thing they think about is therapy for the child. Our Medicare funding for private psychologists and psychiatrists works on that same basis. Do you know that I can see, I can get parents bringing a child, or foster carers bringing a child to see me, and I'll get a Medicare rebate for seeing the child, but I can't see the parents. Yeah, they won't get a Medicare rebate. Yeah. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a little bit crazy. Yeah, it's a little bit crazy because actually, the work requires us to be thinking about the adults in the child's life much more than the child. Yeah, that is, that if we're going to achieve change, it's through the adults being on the same page, or as much of the same page as possible, about what's happening and what do we actually do about it. This is a really endemic idea, yeah, that exists within the field, and that is that, if someone comes, if the child's experienced maltreatment, child abuse or neglect, what they need to do is have 20 years of psychotherapy, and all's going to be a lot better. I'm going to try and disillusion you a little bit around that idea as we go in the presentation that I've got today. Let's move to All right, so what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to cover a little bit around the issues around maltreatment, and the thing I'm really going to focus on today is the interplay between attachment theory, trauma theory, and child development. And I'll kind of talk a bit more about why that's the case. And hopefully we'll actually move to some of the issues that I think we're all going to discuss in the workshops this afternoon, and that is, so what do we do about it? Yeah, the one thing that I'm really clear about is that the predominant agents of change for children that have experienced maltreatment is not me seeing a child 1 hour a week within my rooms. Look, don't get me wrong, I don't mind a child smashing up my room and cleaning it up. I've done it on enough occasions now, working. But really the therapeutic gains are in the day in, day out kind of lived experience of a child across their lifespan across the working week and outside of the working week. And what are the two major places that children hopefully spend their most time at? School and home. School and home, yeah? And so they are, in terms of my own kind of clinical time, they're the places that I tend to focus on the most in terms of what's happening. And, neurobiologically and neurodevelopmentally, there's a lot of reasons why that's where the intervention should be pitched predominantly, yeah? So let's have a look at a couple of things. So we've talked a bit about cumulative harm, yeah? And Robin spoke about it, and so did Gregory. And what we know is that we can't often think about these areas of maltreatment as separate. We know, and Robin showed this with some of the kind of research around family violence, we know that different maltreatment types exist for many of the children that we see. We're not talking about singular events that are one-offs and don't co-occur with other experiences. We know that if there's kind of emotional and psychological neglect due to misattunement and the lack of developing security of attachment, that the experience of children being kind of exposed to other kind of abuse types increases. We know that sexual abuse and physical abuse often kind of co-occurs. We know that the issues around neglect and physical and sexual abuse coexist. So when we're talking about maltreatment or when we're talking about these things, it's really important not to be thinking about them as discrete things, that actually they often co-occur for the really tricky kids that we're working with, yeah? And so, nowadays in the research we're talking about multiple type maltreatment and polyvictimisation. Big words, but it's just important to kind of be thinking about that when we're working. And I think in the research nowadays, we're talking a lot about acts of omission and acts of commission. So where do we go with kind of these things? Well, the thing that I want you to keep in mind during my presentation is that severe abuse and neglect both traumatise, but they also disrupt attachment, and they also impede child development. And they're the things that I kind of really want to focus on today. And so you can see I've got a really sophisticated graph there. It spent me, I spent ages and ages kind of developing this. But the thing that I wanted to say is actually they're really, really interrelated. So when I started, only 14 years ago, but when I started in this field, basically what was happening is that the child developmentalists, they were doing their stuff. The trauma guys, they were doing their stuff, and the attachment guys were doing their stuff, and they weren't really talking to each other. When I started, if you looked at PsychLit, which is our major kind of research database around psychological research, you were getting something like around 2,000 papers on trauma per year. Now there's about 30,000. Yeah, so we're talking about a really burgeoning field, and a lot more of the research, and especially with what we're starting to understand about neurobiology and brain plasticity and what happens to the brain over time, which therefore affects who the person is. We know that actually we know that these are really interrelated ideas that we need to keep in mind. They're not separate, and we can't think about them as separate. So when people say, what's your major kind of modalities? I say, well, I really think a lot about child development. I really think about trauma theory and the impact of trauma on people. And I also keep in mind attachment. And the reason why I keep attachment in mind is that if you can actually establish a secure attachment, or if you can start to create an environment where a child starts to kind of, attach to a parent or a caregiver in more productive ways, you know that there's going to be a lot of other benefits. Yeah, because attachment is the way that we manage our affect, the way that we regulate our emotional experience. And the more secure it is, the better we become with it. So let me talk a little bit about, look, this is a DSM-4 kind of definition of trauma. I'll let you read it yourself. I'm not going to read it for you, but there's lots of debates at the moment. We're about to get the new American Bible of Psychiatry. The DSM-5 is coming into being around May next year, and there's been lots and lots and lots of debates around this. The reason why I'm obviously interested in it is because it has a lot of implications in terms of clinical practice and in particular mental health settings, which is where I predominantly work now. But there are some continuing kind of problems around this definition. It's not to say that it's not accurate, but it also covers things that you've experienced up in this region, for example, kids exposed to bushfires. It also includes things like earthquakes, floods. It also includes things like car accidents, houses burning down, a whole range of things, yeah? The stuff that we're predominantly talking about is actually in relationship to people. Yeah, when we're talking about trauma in our field predominantly, we're talking about relationship traumas. And they're of a different nature and a different kind than the ones that people who've exposed to natural disasters experience. In no way am I saying that natural disasters don't affect children. They do, and we know that they do, and I'm sure a number of you have been working with some of the effects around the bushfires in particular. But there's a different aspect to when we're thinking about and when we're working with children whose kind of trauma is, generally speaking, at the hands of their caregivers. Yeah? And they are the ones that we, day in, day out, are usually kind of addressing. Yeah? We talk about trauma a lot. What is it that I'm talking about? And what is it that we're talking about when we're speaking about trauma? Yeah? Because, the word gets bandied around now much more than what it used to. I'm speaking about it very, very specifically when we're speaking and when I'm speaking about it today. First of all, despite there being some debates around the DSM about whether you should be able to identify an event that occurs, the DSM-5 is really clear that that's still going to be in place. Yeah? In other words, that you still need to be able to identify a traumatic event or a multitude of traumatic events that happens. What we can say categorically now, in terms of both our research evidence and clinical practice, is that people respond to these events. And what events am I talking about? Of course, I'm talking about sexual abuse, physical abuse, exposure to family violence, experience of family violence, and also acts of omission, which are, the neglect of care. Yeah? Let me digress for a moment. I am looking forward to the day. I think some of our work will be done when I don't hear people say to me that a child was in another room when it happened. Yeah, I think that we'll know that we're kind of really progressing when we recognise that that whether a child's hit in a family violence situation, just being in the vicinity and hearing it. I've recounted and heard recount many a story of children I've worked with of them grabbing their sisters and their brothers and going underneath the bed and blocking out their ears and putting music on and other things, yeah? So we're really talking about there being some kind of traumatic event. Our bodies respond to events that overwhelm our capacities to cope with them. Yeah, and there's a whole range of really adaptive responses that we have to overwhelming events. We know, like Gregory talked about, pulse rates being higher. We know that certain kind of chemicals in our bodies get elevated. So there's been lots and lots of research around cortisol in particular. We know that our nervous system responds, and we can say that that response is really fight, flight or fright, yeah? So we really have some of these mechanisms that kick in, and there are some gender differences around some of those things, and there's also some differences depending on, some temperamental and the type of experiences that we have. So, for example, the flight response. The flight response can also include dissociative responses. Yeah. Now, what I mean by dissociative responses is shutting down. We know that children that are stuck in a particular situation and there's no way of running, we know that that's going to be the predominant response that they're going to have. If they're faced with an overwhelming event that they can't get away from, the body responds by shutting down, and that's kind of dissociative. When we have these kind of responses, and if you have a think about where we've moved from the trauma field over the last 15 to 20 years, we now can say pretty categorically that the longer that you remain in that kind of state of fight, flight, freeze, the longer that it lasts, that the more kind of profound the effects are. In other words, when it's not just a discrete event, which then finishes and then you go back to school and go back to your caregivers, but in fact if you're being exposed to this day in, day out, it doesn't just affect your state. In other words, being distressed, being anxious, being wanting to run away or withdrawing. What it starts to affect is who you become. And this is the idea that states become traits. Do you know what I mean when I'm saying states become traits? So the idea of a state is, I had a bad day, I had a fight with my child this morning and I was running late and I'm pissed off and I'm annoyed, yeah? If that remains the case for me, not for that 1 hour, but for days and days and days, it starts to actually impact on who I become. In other words, it starts to impact on what we call personality. So when we're talking about the brain, I think we need to always keep in mind that we're also talking about a person, and that I think we need to keep in mind that in fact, the more that these states occur for us, that they start to orientate how we think about ourselves and who we are, how we think about relationships, and the way that we think about the world. It wouldn't surprise you to know that many of the children that I work with and that people who work in the trauma field work with, is a lot of them actually have, for example, an idea that the world is hostile. They actually believe that the world's not going to give them anything, or that the world is going to withhold from them. Many of them, if you ask them, they often think they're not going to be around for very long. They have an idea of a foreshortened future. So as opposed to a lot of the children, if some of you are parents here, a lot of your children, they'll have ideas about future and planning and thinking about it 20 years' time. A lot of the children that we work with don't have those ideas. They actually think that they're going to not be around for very much at all. The key thing around this graph that I'm trying to demonstrate really is that if we can't stop that fight, flight, freeze response in the short term, and for many of the children that you're seeing, it's probably been on for quite a long time, it's actually going to have turned into traits rather than just states. Yeah? So, what are some of the things that we see when a child has an acute response to stress or experiences a traumatic event that's beyond their coping capacities? A whole range of things, yeah? So you'll see across the continuum of hyper-aroused symptoms to dissociative symptoms, yeah? And Bruce Perry really likes to talk a lot about this kind of continuum that exists for traumatised individuals, yeah? And you'll see some preferences. And so we can divide these kind of, hyper-aroused to dissociative responses to your classic notion of internalisers and externalisers, yeah? So what's an internalising kind of child? What do the internalised children tend to kind of suffer from? Anxiety, yep. Yep, absolutely. Yep. Social phobia, yep. Others? Yep, eating disorders, yep. Self-harm, yep. Yep. Depression, yeah. Those are your kind of internalising behaviours. How about your hyper-aroused responses? These are the ones that do come to our attention. Yeah, the hyper-aroused ones are, I don't worry as much as others about the hyper-aroused kids because, yes, they're hard to manage, but at least you know that something's wrong. Yeah. But so what are some of the things that you'll see there? Yep, aggressive behaviour. Yep. Hyperactivity in the classroom. Sorry? Attention difficulties, concentration problems, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. High risk taking, absolutely. Yeah. Now, as we're describing these, do we see a gender dimension here? Yeah. So we know that girls predominantly will kind of tend to kind of move a bit more to internalisation, and boys will tend to externalise. I'm generalising. Of course, it doesn't mean that you don't swap around. And are we surprised when often there's a really internalising girl and then at the age of 12 or 13, bang, so kind of suddenly something hits and they're engaging in huge risk-taking behaviour and thinking, what the hell happened here? How did that suddenly occur? Well, it wasn't that she wasn't distressed or struggling, it was just that we weren't necessarily picking them up. The internalisers are the ones that I often worry about in schools. They're often the ones not picked up. They're the quiet ones, the ones who are kind of, don't even say boo. It doesn't mean that they might not be affected by kind of acute traumatic responses, yeah? So some of these kind of reactions that I'm pointing out here, they exist across the kind of spectrum of what we're talking about. So let me talk a little bit about the brain, and I'm not going to go into thousands of things, and people are going to say, oh, the brain. We're always talking about the brain, yeah? There are some things that are kind of really important to kind of say about the brain. First of all, I like to see who's built a house here before. Who's gone to build from the very beginning? So I like to see the brain, and when a child's born, as really being at lock-up stage. Yeah, when you've kind of closed the doors and it's locked up, but you've got the wires hanging down. You haven't connected them to the power points, you haven't got the kitchen in, you haven't got the plumbing organised, but your basic infrastructure's there, your hardware, but not your software. Well, that's how infants are born. There's lots of reasons for that. One of them, and it's really good news for those who either want to become mothers or have been mothers, is that if the baby was born much later, you'd die, yeah, because the head would be too big, yeah. And it would actually, biology has really worked out this beautiful kind of balance between how do we get enough going on there, but how do we make sure that the baby can come out, yeah? Because, I know that women who've delivered babies, they say it's pretty big, when it comes out, and, evolution has kind of worked that out reasonably well. The thing is, though, is that we are born and we are the most dependent mammals in the world, yeah? If anyone who's ever been to the zoo and seen a giraffe being born, it's one of those privileges of mine, you'd see the giraffe baby kind of walking within the first 20 minutes of life. Yeah, how long does it take for us? 11, 12, 13 months, sometimes 15, 16 months, still okay. It takes time. It takes time, and there's lots of reasons why it takes time. First of all, we need the environment. Yeah, so when we hear the stories about the Romanian orphanages, yeah, or when we hear the stories about, the Chinese kind of orphanages, or the wolf boy, with a classic kind of case in Europe where he kind of lived with wolves for the first 7 years of his life. What we know is that we're really responsive to sensory stimulation, and in fact we need it. We need it because this thing here, evolutionary-wise, has developed in such a way that it needs time to make all the connections. It needs a lot of time to make all the connections. The fundamental principle is use it or lose it. Yeah? In other words, that through certain parts of our brains getting activated through experience that we develop and we become who we are. And those experiences need to be repetitive, like Gregory before was saying, practice, yeah? There is something about use dependence that's really important. Those of you who have taught one of your children or a child to ride a bike, how did it go the first time? Yeah? Did it go well? Were they riding that bike? I don't think they were riding the bike, yeah? Maybe after the 300th time. I always love when a child for the first time without the training wheels suddenly takes off without you holding the bike, and then you say to them, "Oh, you're doing it," and they suddenly realise and they crash, yeah, because it sounds sad that I actually enjoy that bit, but I enjoy it on theoretical grounds because the beautiful example around that is that actually the brain is ahead of consciousness. Yeah. In other words, that there are a whole bunch of things that are kind of going on that we don't even know are going on, and they're building and they're building and they're building, and you'll see this across a whole range of domains, and that's what I really want to talk about with you all, and that's why it's really important that you're here, because you're actually doing a lot of the really, really hard work. I do the easy work. I see the child, 1 hour a week, or maybe if I'm lucky twice a week, and I do the consultations. But it's actually, parents and people who are actually with children, like over time, that are actually doing the real work of use dependence. Yeah, and use dependence is really kind of important. That's why I kind of have moved away from thinking about therapy to therapeutic interventions. Yeah, everything that we do, Gregory gave the beautiful example about the basketball being played. Everything that we do potentially is use dependent and actually contributes to the development of a child and what they become. So what are some of the kind of key principles? This isn't my own work, this is Bruce Perry's work, but I guess I think there's some really important kind of ideas that we need to keep in mind. First of all, the lower parts of the brain develop before the higher parts of the brain. Yeah, it develops in hierarchical fashion. One of the mistakes that we often make in working with children, one of the mistakes is that we get sucked in by their chronological age. Yeah, we focus on their age and we don't actually focus on the deficits or the other things that have occurred, which means that in fact we may need to think about our therapeutic responses that may address earlier parts of the brain. The problem is that the lower parts of the brain, so if you think about the brain stem or the limbic system and the diencephalon, is that they're harder to change once they start to establish. They take more repetitive actions to kind of start to change over time. But a key principle is to be thinking about that the brain does develop hierarchically. And I don't know, those of you who, I spend my time looking at this stuff, and I really love some of the images that have started to develop around that. There's a whole range of studies that are looking at fetus development, and because now we can actually look at the way the fetus develops, and what you actually see is they're moving through the evolutionary scale. So you actually see them kind of being reptiles, and then you start to see them become kind of early mammals and birds and stuff, and this is us. You actually see the differentiation of those millions of years of biology and evolution start to kind of, even form in the way that that we develop as human beings. As I said before, neurons and the neural system are designed to change in a use-dependent fashion. The brain develops in a sequential fashion, and it develops most fashionably early in life. It's not to say that we can't change things later on. Sometimes we do talk, and I do hear people talk about, traumatised kids' brains are kind of damaged. It's not, I guess I disagree with the idea that they're damaged. What I think the brain has always been has been something that adapts to the environment, and it adapts in particular ways. And if you have a strong focus on survival, it basically means that those survival aspects of our brains will overdevelop. And it means that our kind of exploration parts of our brains, as Gregory said earlier about, for example, if a kid's focusing on survival, how can they actually focus on maths and English and literacy and those things? If that part of the brain is really overused, what it means, it's like a muscle, it'll start to develop more. Yeah, it'll become a much more dominant aspect of what the person kind of focuses on. Neural systems can change, and as I said before, some are harder to change. And the human brain's really designed for a different world. And what we're basically saying, evolution moves slowly. And what I want to say about that is that, a lot earlier on, our predominant focus was really survival. Yeah, and so those parts of our brain are really primed to really develop if our survival is at risk. And make no mistake about it, that for children that live in maltreating environments, their survival's at stake. Yeah, their survival is at stake. And so those parts of the brain are going to develop a lot more easily and overdevelop than the parts which are our cultured aspects, which allow us to kind of learn and develop in different ways. So, just a couple of key principles here. Traumatic events, the more prolonged they are, impact on development and functioning no matter what age the person is who experiences it. But we do know that the brain, that traumatic events do affect the brain differently at different developmental ages and stages. My simple example around this is the difference between the organising brain and the organised brain. So, for example, if someone gets raped as an 18 or 19-year-old but has had a really kind of secure kind of upbringing and has actually kind of developed, it doesn't mean that they won't be traumatised from that event, but they've got a lot more of their kind of basic infrastructure set up, yeah? And so in some ways the effects aren't going to be profound. If you're experiencing traumatic events from the day you were born, it actually means that the way that your brain develops is actually kind of affected, yeah? Does that make sense to people, that kind of differentiation between the organising and the organised brain? Okay. I'm going to talk about this one in my workshop a bit more, so I'm going to skip the bits that we know. But just a simple kind of example about severe neglect. We know that severe neglect does actually impact on brain size. You might also see those little grey bits in the middle, for those of you can see them. They're the ventricles. You can see that the ventricles are larger in neglect. That basically means that your kind of grey matter, which is really your kind of core strength, or the things that make you kind of cognitively strong, those bits there's not as much of them, yeah? And it's just really important to kind of see that it doesn't just affect the infrastructure but also size. Okay, so I want to turn now to development. Yeah, so let's think a lot about development. I'm going to really focus on relationship development and another area that I'm really interested in, which is around language development. Yeah, I work a lot with speechies and OTs nowadays, and some of my thinking has been influenced by some of their work. So when you saw the still face kind of videos earlier, you would have seen the mother engaging in motherese. Yeah, and that's that beautiful thing, and we all do it, don't we, when we see a baby? Yeah, like I do it whenever I see a baby. I start to dramatise my kind of features. I start to talk more in a baby voice, sing-song kind of quality. Yeah, it's really important for language development. Motherese, being able to talk to your baby, is one of the things that helps people develop words. And what are the things that our kids struggle with? Putting words to their behaviours, putting words to feelings, being able to kind of name. And language is the digestive juices of the psyche. It's how we process and kind of understand experiences. This was a study, it's an old one, 1991, and they actually looked at the amount that a mum was talking to her child, and they divided it up into kind of mums who do only a little bit of motherese, mums who do an average amount, and mums who talk lots and lots to their children. And have a look at the word development at the age of just over 2 years of age. Yeah, we're talking about a 600-word difference between mothers who don't talk very much and mums who do. Yeah, 600-word difference at the age of 2 plus. Yeah. Babies don't know day and night. Babies don't know that they're hungry. Babies don't know any notion of actually what's going on in their body and what it means. How do they get to know it? They get to know it through motherese and through the actions of their caregivers. Yeah. So, you must be really tired right now. You're yawning. That must mean you're tired. Or you're doing, you must be hungry. You need a feed. Yeah. This is the way that children actually start to orientate to themselves and the world. Yeah. Plus, they start to actually develop language. Yeah. Now, if you think about this kind of 600-word age difference at the age of just over 2 years of age, and that pattern continues by the time that they're in kindergarten and then when they're actually at primary school, how much behind do you reckon those kids are going to be when they're starting to read? And how good do you reckon they're going to feel about that? They see other kids starting to pick up reading. They start to actually pick up that, they're not as quick. Teachers, whether you like it or not, teachers really love the smart kids. They feel good as teachers when kids are kind of progressing really well. It's just like I really love the kids who've got emotional landscapes and can talk to me in therapy, as opposed to the kids that I have to kind of retch words out of them to kind of start to get an idea about what's going on with them. We're all human, and these things are responding, we respond to them in particular ways. If this is happening day in, day out, it's cumulative. It's a cumulative effect. So even now, we've got the national kind of benchmarks, the NAPLAN test, yeah? And we're testing at 3, year 3, year 5, year 7, and there's some optional testing in year 7. What's happening for, say, disadvantaged kids as opposed to kind of kids within middle class and upper class families? The kids who are doing well, what we're seeing is massive changes after grade prep. You'll see the kids that are kind of reading and already kind of got this kind of language kind of competence. During holidays, what do you reckon they're doing for the 6 or 8 weeks over Christmas? They're reading. How do you reckon those kids come back to the kids that don't have literacy in their households? So the gap, kind of the inequality and the kind of difference starts to accentuate. You're starting to get an exponential change over time. And we're seeing this, we're seeing these in our NAPLAN results right now. It's really clear when they're starting to benchmark this that you're starting to get this. Okay, this is the best study I've ever seen done around language development and maltreatment or environments. It was an old study by Risley. He took him and a bunch of researchers, he's dead now unfortunately, but he's a fantastic researcher. It took about 5 or 6 years to encode this. They went to the household very similar to the previous study, where they basically went in 1 hour a week over 2 years, and they looked at across demographics, across families, including maltreated environments, and they looked at the amount of language actually exposure within the actual family environment. Yeah. They started to do this because they were starting to intervene at the age of 5 or 6 with, Head Start and other things like that. And what they were finding is actually the gains were really slight. And so they thought, I think we need to get in earlier. I don't think we're kind of engaging in kind of language enrichment early enough. What they found was that they measured the amount of words spoken to the child from the age of 7 months to 36 months. High verbal families took more than 500 verbal turns in an hour in their interactions with their babies, whereas low verbal families, which took about 150. By the age of 3, they estimated that the children of high verbal families had heard over 33 million words, whilst other children only heard 10 million words. That's a big difference, isn't it? That's a really, really big difference. And look at the effects of that even at the age of 9. What they found was more parental talk, more vocab and higher IQ scores. The amount of language exposure was critical to the development of language and also cognitive development, and they were maintained, those differences were maintained at the age of 9. So again, use dependence, yeah? And can I just say there was something really important in this research that I'll try and talk about in the workshop, which was that what they actually found in this research was that it wasn't just the real major difference outside of the volume of words that were spoken in these kind of culturally and linguistically enriched environments, but it was also the type of language. So in the families where there was this low verbal turns, it was a lot of instrumental language. Do you know what I mean by instrumental? In other words, come and eat. Go and do your homework. It's time to have a shower now. In the high verbal turn families, it was chit-chat. It was, so how was your day, and blah, 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 blah. It was descriptive, narrative kind of language, yeah? If I take a message from this, and those who work in early childhood, try and get your parents to speak more to their children. Yeah, I know it's kind of like a really, yeah, of course, but so many of the mothers and the fathers that I work with who've come from kind of impoverished environments, they actually feel embarrassed to speak to their children. They never really experienced it themselves, and they find it very, very hard. They actually think it's stupid, and not only that, they don't think their children are going to understand. So they've got this notion that, why would I speak to them? They're not kind of reciprocating. Yeah, they're not actually going to pick up on what I say. Actually, language builds reciprocation. Language actually builds it over time. Yeah? Is it any wonder that many maltreated children have speech and language problems? Yeah? that their expressive and their receptive language is lower, and they have articulation issues. And not only that, they have pragmatic deficits. Do you know what I mean by pragmatic deficits? Turn-taking, being able to understand the rules of social engagement and communication. These are the bedrock of what makes us kind of, social. Yeah, a lot of the kids that we kind of work with, they have these pragmatic deficits. So let me speak. Okay. So let's talk. So that's language. Now let me talk about social development and social relations and why these kids might kind of struggle to kind of form a relationship with us, and why we find it really tough. This was a study by Bruce Perry in the States. They looked at the amount of relational interactions that a child, latency-aged kid, I think it was this one here, was about 8 years of age, during a 24-hour cycle, averaged out over time of how many interactions that they were having over the course of a 24-hour period. So you can see 24 at night's 12 midnight, 12 is noon, 6 in the morning. That's why you're not seeing many during the sleep time, yeah? This is a kind of an average kind of, kid with a kind of okay family, and the arrows are pointing to the kind of relationship. So, the outer circle would be kids in the schoolyard, the middle circle would be their direct family, that's how they kind of mix the three circles. So it's a little bit like the circle of kind of, influence, or the that we often work with kids about. So that's a kind of a match sample kind of kid that's kind of, pretty much your normal age sample. This is a child protection kid. And a number of these interactions for this kid were negative. So if you're having that day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out, how do you reckon you're going to get along with others? It's pretty striking, don't you think, the difference? These are our kids. These are our maltreated kids, yeah? They don't have many positive social interactions when they're younger. They don't learn how to actually relate to others very well. No wonder they find it hard to kind of relate and develop relationships with us, and no wonder lots of people kind of give up on them, yeah? Because actually they actually don't know how to do it very well, yeah? They haven't developed the skill set. The thing that's really important to think about here is obviously we need to kind of really keep in mind that that these things require experiences and positive experiences. So when Gregory was talking earlier about Jasper Mountain and other kind of examples of interventions, it's really about trying to change the scripts that develop about yourself, relationships, and the world that we're trying to work on. So I wanted just to talk very, very briefly about, because obviously, we've talked a little bit about kind of Indigenous populations as well here, is that obviously we need to keep in mind that there are environments due to a whole range of adverse events that have happened within those communities. And, if we think about Indigenous populations in Australia, the effect of colonisation and the breaking of the symbolic law that happened in those times. People don't kind of often think about what it would mean when you've got a highly regulated system of kind of kinship ties, what it would mean when suddenly you get all put into a mission together where you're breaking every single taboo that you would have learnt over, 50,000 years, yeah? Not only that, we also had through the late 1800s and early, last century, we had the stolen generations and the taking away of children from their parents. And how do you learn how to be a parent? Yeah, you learn it through modelling. You learn it through being mothered and fathered. So it's one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about trauma, is that we need to be thinking about, that there's actually communities that are traumatised and have actually experienced a whole range of things. I'm not trying to take away, and this is really important for me to say, that there's actually a lot of resilience shown within Indigenous populations within our communities, but no doubt there's also been things that have impacted on their ability to actually, regenerate over time. And so if you have a look at the just some of the stats, and this is where the stolen generations isn't just in the past, it's actually, present for us in various ways now. If you have a look at some of the stats, you can see that, even look at the DECD report, that 47.1% of Aboriginal children reported that a relative had been removed, yeah? You can't have those kind of experiences without having a level of cultural trauma that also occurs because of it. Okay. How are we doing for time? I reckon I'm going to try and squeeze in another 5 minutes and give you all a break. There's a couple of things that kind of are really important to think about, and I'll speak a lot more about this in the workshop this afternoon about attachment theory. I guess, you know, I'm kind of an attachment theory kind of practitioner really, and it's really influenced a lot of my thinking. There's been over 20,000 attachment studies done across the world. People say a lot to me, often they'll ask me about, but are there cultural differences around attachment? Well, there's been attachment studies done across like many different kind of communities across the world, and the one thing that we can say is that, you know, it's pretty much our biological endowment as humans. Yeah, in other words, because we're so helpless as infants, we need adults to help us become interdependent. Yeah, it takes time. We wouldn't be able to survive without developing an attachment and without parents bonding to us. And there are a number of kind of key ingredients. Now, can I just say that it's really important to keep in mind when we think about attachment is that the person who bonds with the child, the primary caregiver, often has a web of people who support them. Yeah? And when those things are kind of missing, it makes the kind of job kind of a lot more difficult. And what we know is that the ratios of adults to children has actually kind of reversed over the last few hundred years. In other words, once upon a time there would be something like 20 adults looking after one child. Now we often have situations where there's one parent looking after 5 children. Yeah? The idea that it takes a village to raise a child is as relevant today as it ever was for us, and that the more that we can actually support communities and support parents doing their job, the more likely it is that we're actually going to be able to help children develop more security in their attachment to their parents. These are the kind of major things that kind of, you know, matter in terms of secure attachment. I'll talk quite a bit about attunement this afternoon because it's an idea that we often talk about, but what is it and why is it so important, and why do people like me keep on banging on about attunement? Why is it that we think it's kind of really important? I just wanted to kind of speak a little bit about this, and I guess I've trained in this methodology around the circle of security, and this is a thing to think about for us. It doesn't matter what age. So when it's a 15-year-old who comes to us, or whether it's a 3-year-old, that the attachment-seeking behaviours are mutually exclusive from exploration behaviours. The bottom part of the curve there, where it says safe haven, is when a child's actually seeking proximity to their caregiver and seeking safety. It's when they sense danger, all going well. Yeah, all going well, the attachment system gets activated when we feel danger and when children feel danger. Of course, that often becomes wonky if it hasn't worked out right between a caregiver and a child. What often happens in our field is that we're often pushing kids, like I often think about kids that come into foster care and because they might have had deprived environments, the foster carers and agencies are really pushing this kid to kind of do a whole range of things: swimming, you know, kite flying, you know, attending extra tuition, whole range of other things. Great idea, really important idea. But I tell you, the thing that they actually need the most is to develop felt security and start to actually develop a kind of secure attachment. Attachment is the way that we manage distress. Actually having a secure attachment is the way that we actually regulate our affect. And you know, when I showed that graph around, you know, what is trauma, if we can actually drop arousal, and I'm not talking about sexual arousal, I'm talking about, you know, if we can actually drop the level of anxiety that a child feels, they'll start to learn. They'll start to be able to stay in school better. They'll start to actually be able to learn maths, yeah? And that's what's so important about developing kind of, you know, a level of security and attachment. How does attachment affect us? Well, it affects us in the way that we start to see ourselves, the way that we see relationships, and the way that we see the world. When children don't actually have positive experiences with others, what ends up happening is that they start to form kind of wonky ideas about who they are. So when Gregory earlier talked about the 25 to 50 reparative experiences required, it requires repetition of positive experiences to start to change these scripts. The kids that we work with will often hold ideas that they're unlovable, that they're bad, that they've done something wrong, that they're worthless. They'll often have ideas about what they think about relationships, and generally it's that relationships are things to be avoided. We don't think that they're good things, and I'm going to try and avoid to develop a relationship with you. And as I said earlier, that they actually, often have certain views about the world and whether the world's going to be giving. These are things generally for most of us we take for granted in our own experience. Now I'm generalising here. I know that many people in the field have had their own adverse events, but for most of us, we haven't had the kind of experiences which would make us think about ourselves in particular ways. No wonder when these children come into foster care, and as Gregory said about reconnaissance, no wonder they'll often work really, really hard to replicate what they know. Yeah, that's why they'll make sure that so how many foster carers I've worked with who'll be really surprised by their emotional reactions to children. Where I remember one saying, "I felt like hitting them, and I've never felt like hitting anyone before." Yeah, that's not because the foster carer suddenly has become someone who wants to hit children. It's the ongoing kind of provocation and perhaps the lack of support to understand what's going on for the foster carer, which leads them to kind of be in that situation. And so I'm really this is such a simplification of attachment theory, but wanted to really kind of illustrate the positive and internal working model. The working model is something we need to be thinking about because it affects how someone goes, the way that they actually relate to the world. Parts of it are conscious, but a lot of it's like an iceberg. A lot of it exists underneath the water, and children don't even know what they're kind of doing with it. So this is the bit that I think I'm going to talk about more this afternoon because of the time. But we've talked about this all morning around, who holds the key to recovery. Well, we actually all do. We all do. If we think that we can work in a non-collaborative way and just do our own thing and not actually try and work together to change some of the scripts that have developed for kids that we're working with, it's not going to work. And I look forward to anyone giving me examples where that's happened and it has worked, because I haven't yet experienced it so far in my practice. I just wanted to just let me talk about people have a tip sheet. So let me talk about my tip sheet. There's a few things I think that are really, really important for us to be thinking about. We talk a lot about the deficits or the things that's kind of, that kids are struggling with, but we always need to be looking for the exceptions and to be looking at the ways that, I often think about the way the children relate who've been traumatised are adaptive responses to the situations they experienced. That we can't expect that we're going to do the work without setbacks and without sometimes the children we work with regressing in their behaviours. Robin talked a lot about the fears, including the struggles after dark. Kind of, sleep hygiene, or what we call kind of routines around going to bed, is really critical for the kids that we work with. Nighttime is a terrifying time, and if you think about it, when does violence usually happen? When is it that kids are usually kind of hiding under the covers? It's nighttime. Yeah, nighttime's going to be one of the areas that's a major trigger point for a lot of the kids that we work with. I'm pretty keen on kind of some psychoeducation, particularly as kids start to get a bit older. A lot of the kids that I've worked with, that they often think, for example, when they hear voices that they're going mad. Yeah. What we know is that voices aren't just psychotic. That lots of kids who have experienced kind of sexual abuse and physical abuse will hear a voice that feels foreign to them and seems foreign. They might even identify it as a particular person speaking to them. Yeah. It's really important to be talking about the symptoms of trauma with children so that they can start to understand that it's not about what's wrong with them but what's happened to them that's kind of creating some of the symptoms that they see. Provide opportunities for recreation, communicate, maintain routines and avoid the new, as Gregory said, transitions. And also the other thing to keep in mind is if a kid kind of holds a certain idea about themselves, I've seen some kids who have come into care, for example, who've never had their birthday celebrated. Never. Yeah, never. And often when they come into foster carers feel so bad about it that they think they should chuck them a really, really big party. And I often say, look, I don't think that's a good idea. And I say, why not? I say, because I don't think they're ready. And they say, what do you mean? I said, look, I think it's going to not turn out well. sometimes foster carers have heard me say that and kind of agreed with me. Others have kind of chucked the big family party, and they come back and see me a week later and they say, yeah, the cake ended up being in my nephew's face, and the wall was kicked and it didn't kind of end up very well. Why did that happen? They weren't ready. It wasn't how they saw themselves, and they weren't up for that kind of enjoyment. The other thing they'll struggle with, a lot of kids that we work with, is when we try and have pleasurable activities that last for too long. They'll go really well for an hour, but if we try and do it for 3 hours, it'll blow up. Yeah? They'll introduce lots of family members too quickly. Yeah? So this idea about, how do you introduce it slowly, including kind of trying to pace how quickly they attach to us as well. Because sometimes we know, people will kind of, kids will kind of attach to us really quickly, and that actually may not be a good thing either. I know that sounds strange, but, I've seen the effect of that, even when it's happened for me in my therapeutic work with children. Be mindful of triggers, and I'll talk a lot more about the kind of, how we make sense of triggers. And triggers aren't just about what's experienced. Remember, triggers are across the 5 senses. So you might have children who actually react due to smells, due to certain kind of touch or sensory experiences. So, one of the things that we're trying to do clinically now is do a lot more sensory profiling of kids that we're working with to try and pick up how they actually relate to the world and what tends to trigger them. We know that traumatic memories aren't just visual memories, and it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. Keep anniversary reactions in mind and develop plans to manage hyperarousal and dissociative symptoms, and I'll talk a bit more about that this afternoon. And take your own pulse. You've got to look after yourself to do this work, and I know that Gregory was talking earlier about not smoking and eating well. Really important that we look after ourselves, because this work's really wearing if you don't. And I kind of think that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I've seen too many shooting stars in this field where, their star shines really, really brightly, but then it's not sustainable work. And to make it sustainable and to make a real difference, you've got to hang in there, both in your profession but also with the children you're working with. Thank you.